السلام عليكم، كيف الحال يا جماعة؟ يقول لك هذا الفيديو راح يتسبب في إنقاذ 58 شخص. بس قبل نبدأ نشوف هذا الفيديو، إذا عندكم فيديوهات تبون تشوفون ردة فعل عليها ارسلوها بتويتر أو انستغرام، مكان اللي تحبونه. والحين خلونا نبدأ.
Let's save your life today, not long term, today. By specifically finding out what's most likely to kill you next week so you can actually avoid it. First, let's assume that 3 million people will watch this video and that you're all among our typical viewers. You're between the ages of 15 and 35 and you're living in Western countries. We based this video on statistics specifically for your demographic and our own estimates. They're not perfect, but roughly correct. Don't worry, we might also save your life if you're older or live somewhere else. Okay, now let's gather all 3 million of you in 40 packed football stadiums. Look around. Most of you are teens and young adults. So much potential. Unfortunately, by the end of next week, 58 of you watching right now will not be alive anymore. 3,000 of you will sadly have passed in a year.
يا ساتر يا ساتر.
1,000. Or not. Today, we will save your life by looking at the avoidable ways you might die. We'll not cover long-term things like diseases because we want to prevent your death next week. Your life consists of millions of micro-decisions and some of you are on a path that will end soon. Can we guide you down a different path? Humans are incredibly bad at judging the real risks of life. Bad things happen to people all the time because there are so many of us. And since the news focuses so much on freak accidents, we have a completely distorted picture of what actually poses a danger to us. For example, the chance any of you are going to die in a terror attack is below 0.0002%. There are super risky activities that are clearly insanely dangerous, like wingsuit flying. If all 3 million of you were to practice this sport, about 285 of you would die just next week.
الحمد لله إني أكره
المرتفعات. That are pretty dangerous.
مستحيل أسوي الشيء
ذا. If all
of
you rode a motorcycle, 35 of you would not survive next week. If you don't want this kind of risk in your life, well, don't do these things. It turns out what's most likely to kill you next week are things that feel safe, that you do all the time and are routine, things you may even be really good at. This is what we'll prevent. By far the most dangerous thing you're currently doing is driving. 8 of you will die in a car crash just next week. 416 of you over the next year. Mostly because most of you are not aware what driving really is. You're zooming through the world in a metal torpedo at the speed of a cheetah or faster. In an average car that weighs 1.5 tons at roughly 60 kilometers an hour or 40 miles an hour, you have the mechanical energy of a piano dropped from the top of the Statue of Liberty. If you crash, this energy is released into your car and, more importantly, your body. 30% of deadly car accidents are caused by speeding, mostly because you overestimate yourself. But that will kill 2 of you next week. It's very straightforward. If you go fast, you have less time to react and only notice the danger when it's too late. A lot of you watching tend to go the speed limit regularly, which saves very little time. If your destination is 20 minutes away at 100 kilometers an hour or 60 miles an hour, driving 15 kilometers an hour or 10 miles an hour faster will save less than 3 minutes. But your probability of a deadly crash increases by 60%. So 2 of you may survive next week if you just tone down your speeding. This alone would eliminate the most dangerous activity in your life. Isn't this wild? Close second is drinking alcohol and driving, causing 25% of deadly crashes. In the next week, this will also kill 2 of you. You don't even need to feel drunk. You just have to have consumed enough to slow your reaction time. Even if you still feel completely in control, chances are high that you're not. Aside from being extremely illegal, it's one of the most reckless and dangerous things too many people do regularly. And it's easy to avoid. Just don't do it, ever. Taking a cab after that work event next week, even if you only had 2 drinks, might save your life. Just because you were distracted while driving, 1 of you will die next week. Maybe because you were eating or fumbling with the radio, but let's be real, probably because you were looking at your phone. If you drive at 60 kilometers an hour or 40 miles an hour and check your phone for just a moment, you've now crossed an entire football.
دايما اشوف قدامي وانا امشي بالسياره واحد يلف، اقول هذا صاحي ولا مجنون. لما اقرب القى على جواله. اتركوا الجوالات وركزوا بالخط. انا ما استخدم الجوال ابد، ما ابغى اعلمكم ايش السبب بس يلا دام فتحت الموضوع. مره رقيت رصيف. ليش؟ لاني كنت استخدم الجوال، فجاه حصلت نفسي داخل فوق الرصيف.
Completely blind. Stop doing this and you might survive next week. Lastly, we want to have an especially frank word with the 3 of you that will die because you didn't wear a seatbelt. What an incredibly stupid way to die young. Way more of you will get into a car crash and be injured for all the same reasons. And of course, often the victims of crashes are not to blame at all, and many of you watching right now will end up hurting someone else. But you now know how to reduce the chances of this happening massively. Let's move on to other deadly things that you can easily avoid. 26 of you will die by falling, or more precisely by hitting the ground in the next year, which means 1 of you will die every 2 weeks.
Yes, Anthony.
You'd think the danger of height was not as big of a deal, but it is. Going up ladders, working on scaffolding or on a roof, and going hiking in nature is normal. But falling from a height of just 2 meters has about the same mechanical energy as a bowling ball dropped from a 7-story building. You probably wouldn't want to be hit by it, and it only gets worse the higher you go. For a fall from 5 meters, the height of a large ladder, the equivalent would be the energy of a bowling ball dropped from a 19-story building. But even just falling over can easily be fatal because your head is all the way at the top of your body. Another surprisingly dangerous thing is water. 1 of you will drown next week. Being in and around water is fun and doesn't seem to be a big deal, mainly for 3 reasons. You'll underestimate how dangerous a body of water is and be taken by strong currents or riptides. You'll overestimate your swimming abilities. You're most likely a much worse swimmer than you think. Or, also sadly common, you'll go into the water drunk, especially dangerous because you're more reckless and even more likely to be overwhelmed by a cold shock or hypothermia. Harmless situations around water turn deadly so quickly that in the US, drowning is the 2nd most common cause of death by accident for kids. After, you may have guessed it, car crashes. So if you're going for a swim next week, keep this in mind. Make sure that the water is safe, assume you are at best a mediocre swimmer, and you won't die. Also, for the love of God, be careful on cruise ships. If you go overboard, you have a 60% chance of dying. Let's move on to the thing that will kill the most people watching this video. This one is extremely sad and very delicate because sensationalist public discussion can make it worse. It's harming yourself. Statistically, about 10 of you could die this way next week. There's something that you might not be aware of that might save your life. The majority of these deaths happen in crisis situations, usually triggered by traumatic events and extraordinary circumstances that overwhelm people and undermine their coping strategies. Studies show that suicide rarely occurs out of the blue. There are warning signs, and often suicidal thoughts and feelings can be mastered by getting professional help, for example from a crisis intervention center. Most people who survive an attempt don't try again and end up being very glad that they did survive. It was just way too much for them, and they felt desperate and as if there was no way out. It would be so nice if someone watching this who's in a bad spot decides to get help. You matter, you really do, and the world is better with you in it. Please stay with us. If you currently feel overwhelmed by life, seeking help is not weakness, it's strength. We've put some resources for you in the video description. This also means another thing. If you have someone in your life going through a crisis, withdrawing, expressing hopelessness, or talking about this topic, even jokingly, take it seriously. Show them that they're loved and important. You personally could save a life, maybe next week already. You might never know, but worst case, you've been a true friend.
الحين بنشوف فيديو وش يصير لو القمر ضرب الأرض ودمرها. ايش بيصير؟ يب ربط المواضيع عجيب. قبل شوي بننقذ 50 شخص، الحين بندمر البشرية كلها.
We are answering an age-old, very scientific and important question. What if the moon crashes into Earth? It's more interesting and weird than you probably think. Let's start with the basics. Why isn't the moon on its way to crash into us already? We know that Earth's gravity pulls everything towards it, including the moon, but somehow it stays up, as if suspended by some opposite force. But there is no other force countering gravity. Instead, the trick to staying is a sideways motion that we call an orbit. You see orbits every day. When you throw a ball, it makes a tiny little orbit. The only difference between the ball's orbit and the moon's is that the ball eventually hits the ground. Basically, the reason is speed. If you could throw your ball fast enough, it would bend around the world and come back to you. If there were no air slowing it down, it could orbit forever. And this is what the moon does, falling sideways around Earth very fast with no air slowing it down, orbiting Earth every 27 days at 3,600 kilometers an hour. So, for the moon to just stop in its orbit and plummet to the Earth would break more laws of physics than we have time to explain. So, how do we crash it into Earth? In a nutshell, to change an object's orbit, you need to change its speed, which changes where gravity takes it. But even small changes require enormous forces, which is why all the large objects in the solar system are so stable nowadays. According to science, the moon is big and very massive. Even igniting billions of rocket engines all over its surface would barely move the moon. It looks like nothing short of magic will make the moon fall, so we'll use a magic spell that slows down the moon so much that it changes its orbit and spirals towards Earth. To get the most from the experience, the moon will take exactly 1 year before it hits Earth. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Magic. Month 1. For the first few days, nothing really changes. The moon gets a tiny bit brighter and scientists get confused, but the rest of us don't notice anything different. The only noticeable real effect of the moon on the Earth are the tides. Tides exist because while Earth pulls on the moon's gravity pulls back on the Earth. Since the strength of gravity gets weaker with distance, different parts of the Earth feel a slightly different pull, which causes the Earth, especially the oceans, to bulge when the moon is above them and contract a little on the sides when it's not. As Earth rotates every day underneath the moon's influence fluctuates, causing the water level of the oceans to rise and fall by about half a meter twice a day. But with the moon drawing ever closer, high tide gets higher every day. At first barely noticeable, within a month the moon has covered half the distance to the Earth and ocean tides have grown to 4 meters. Every day high tide comes and waves flood coastal cities. And there's no end in sight. With the moon drawing ever closer, tides rise ever higher, inundating another city and more inhabited land with salty water every day. Month 2. By the end of month 2, the moon has covered 2/3 of the distance to Earth and global infrastructure is crumbling as tides rise above 10 meters, displacing up to 1 billion people who happen to live near the coastlines. As ports become inoperable, shipping grinds to a halt. Not only will it slow down the delivery of Kurzgesagt products, but also less exciting things like food. Global communications fall into disarray. 95% of the internet is carried by ocean-crossing cables, and while these largely don't mind the water, their terminals on land do. Living inland doesn't guarantee safety either. Tidal bores cause rivers to flow backwards, carrying salt water to contaminate surface and groundwater supplies. Gas shortages follow as all refineries near the coast are abandoned. Countries are left with the supplies they had on their shelves, and strict rationing will begin. In the cities, chaos reigns during the scavenging hours of low tide, while survivors take refuge in high-rises when the water returns. Month 3. 3 months in and the moon is close enough to disrupt communication and navigation satellites. While it's normally far too distant for its gravity to cause any major problems for our satellites, the closer it gets, the more warped their orbits become. As their fuel for orbital corrections runs out, satellites careen out of control. Months 4 and 5. On Earth, the tides are rapidly growing to about 30 meters and will be reaching 100 meters in height in a few short weeks. At low tide, the ocean recedes hundreds of kilometers, exposing the continental shelf like vast deserts, while at high tide, walls of water drown agriculture, houses and skyscrapers. And now, almost 5 months in, the apocalypse has finished its warm-up act. Since the oceans are on average only 3 kilometers deep, the tides have
يجون
reached
الحين
their
الأسماك يسكنون في
maximum.
المدينة.
Up until now, the
حلو
water in
المسكن.
the oceans could flow, absorbing most of the moon's gravitational squeezing, but now the Earth itself is really feeling the squeeze of the ever-approaching moon. These aren't so much tides of water, but tides of rock. The squeezing of the planet, combined with the weight of quintillions of tons of water sloshing on and off the tectonic plates, creates enormous stresses below and begins to cause earthquakes of increasing magnitude and intensity. It's impossible to say how serious these earthquakes might be or where they occur, but like a child jumping on their bed until it breaks, no good can come of it. Strong tidal forces lead to volcanism on other planets and moons. On Earth, squeezing the planet disrupts the magma reservoirs inside the crust, triggering sizable climate-altering eruptions in Chile, New Zealand, Yellowstone, and elsewhere.
الأرض قاعدة تغرق وفي
Meanwhile, watching
براكين.
patiently above is the
حرفيا تدمير
moon,
كامل.
still no bigger in the sky than a small cloud. Within 75,000 kilometers of Earth, it is bright enough to illuminate the night sky like twilight. Months 6 and 7. After half a year, the moon is entering the space once occupied by geosynchronous satellites where it orbits Earth every 24 hours. It appears to float at one spot in the sky, unmoving, cycling through a full set of phases every day, but only visible to half the planet. With the moon stationary above the Earth, the tides seem to freeze in place. Half the world flooded, half with its water seemingly returned to the sea, as if Earth is holding its breath to prepare for the worst. As the moon sinks further, you might wonder if its gravity would overpower Earth's, pulling you up and ending your misery. Fortunately not. The Earth's surface gravity is about 6 times stronger than the moon's, so even if the moon were hovering right on top of you, you would still stay on the ground. On the moon, things are different though. The near side of the moon is more strongly affected by Earth's gravity, so during the next few months, it starts to stretch forward towards the Earth into something of an egg, triggering deep moonquakes as the lunar rock flexes and changes shape. Though barely noticeable now, this squish will grow to hundreds of kilometers in a matter of months. Months 8 to 11. At this point, the apocalypse has arrived, and we can summarize the months before the crash as everybody left has a really bad time. The tides sweeping over the Earth slow down and then reverse their direction because the moon now orbits Earth faster than it rotates. The planet will experience an abundance of earthquakes and volcanism. Massive amounts of volcanic aerosols rise high into the stratosphere, shining enough to reflect sunlight back into space. What little light gets through is rust red and is periodically diminished by daily eclipses. The result is a rapid global cooling with acid rains and summer snows killing even the hardiest plants. The clock runs out on civilization. Billions have perished while an X-shaped moon is still drawing closer. Let's get ready for the grand finale.
يلا.
Month 12.
هو بقى حياة أصلاً.
Finally, at the end of the year, the moon has reached the Roche limit. That's the point where Earth's gravitational pull on the moon is stronger than the moon's own gravity. Things on the lunar surface start falling towards Earth, and by the time it crosses 10,000 kilometers, the entire moon disintegrates into rubble, smearing itself into a massive ring system around the Earth. Fortunately, the moon's disintegration means the misery on Earth has ended. No moon means the general apocalyptic nature of things comes to a halt. The oceans recede, flowing off the land one last time. Any survivors are treated to a view of tremendous arches spanning the sky, glimmering in the sunlight, illuminating the night sky more brilliantly than any full moon ever could, while meteor showers of moon dust fill the sky. It's hard to say what happens next, but the tranquility may be short-lived. If too much moon dust rains down, friction heats the atmosphere, possibly boiling the oceans. If not, the enormous shadows cast by the rings, combined with all the volcanic and meteoric aerosols, block even more sunlight, and a period of runaway cooling could begin that freezes much of Earth's surface solid.
يعني ما راح ننجو.
In any case, at some point people will emerge again.
Okay.
From submarines or bunkers or mountain tops. They will not have a great time before rebuilding civilization, and their success is not guaranteed, but at least they'll be trying to do so with beautiful rings in the sky.
اوكي السيناريو مختلف عن اللي في راسي، اللي توقعتهم انهم بيتصادمون. وبس يا جماعه وصلنا الى نهايه الفيديو، اتمنى انكم استمتعتوا. شكرا للمشاهده، لا تنسون اللايك واشتراك. اشوفكم في الفيديو الجاي، مع السلامه.